Hey, everyone, and welcome back. 1968. A lot of people consider it like a turning point in American history.
Yeah.
A year so, tumultuous
Right.
that you can still feel the amongst today.
Absolutely.
And I'm really excited about today's deep dive because we're going to be looking at it through this really fascinating podcast episode
Yeah.
called The Fall of LBJ.
Okay.
Now, for those of you who maybe weren't around then, LBJ is Lyndon B. Johnson,
Right.
the president who was kind of at the helm during this time.
Right in the thick of it.
Yeah, exactly, right in the thick of it. And I thought it was so interesting how the episode, reveals the personal drama
Uh-huh.
that was happening behind the scenes in the White House.
Right.
And how that drama ultimately, reshaped the political landscape,
Yeah. And it's interesting how, personal flaws and political pressures can all kind of come together, especially during times of crisis.
Yeah.
And LBJ, for all his political talent and legislative achievements, he was a man full of contradictions.
Well, let's set the stage. So it's 1968.
Okay.
5 years after JFK's assassination.
Right.
The country's still kind of reeling from that loss.
Yeah.
The Vietnam War is escalating,
Yeah.
sending shockwaves through American society.
Yeah.
Cities are erupting in riots fueled by racial tensions and economic inequality.
Right.
It's a powder keg
It is.
of a year.
Yeah.
And right in the middle of all of it is Lyndon B. Johnson,
Right.
this larger-than-life Texan
Yeah.
who ascends to the presidency after Kennedy's death.
Exactly.
He was a man of immense political talent, known for his ability to
Yeah.
strong-arm legislation
Uh-huh.
through Congress.
Yeah.
The Johnson treatment.
The Johnson treatment, yeah.
Yeah, the episode paints this really vivid picture of LBJ, backroom deals, intense persuasion tactics,
Yeah.
maybe even a few choice words
Oh, yeah.
that we can't repeat here.
Right.
He was a force.
It was a force of nature.
But he also had this deeply insecure side,
Yeah.
stemming from his time as Kennedy's VP.
There's this sense that he always felt like an outsider in the Kennedy circle, almost looked down upon in a way.
Yeah.
And that insecurity, that need to prove himself might have played a role in his unwavering commitment to the Vietnam War, even as it became increasingly unpopular.
It's almost Shakespearean.
It is.
Isn't it? This brilliant, flawed figure grappling with these impossible choices, haunted by his past, and ultimately brought down by his own demons.
Exactly. And to understand the fall of LBJ, we need to understand the quagmire that was Vietnam.
Right.
By 1968, over 500,000 U.S. troops were on the ground.
Right.
Casualties were mounting.
Right.
And the public was growing increasingly disillusioned.
Yeah. And back home, the anti-war movement was gaining momentum.
Right.
With massive protests and slogans like, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?
Yeah.
Ringing out across college campuses and city streets.
Ex-
So this wasn't just a war overseas. It was dividing families, friends,
Yeah.
and the very fabric of American society.
Uh-huh.
And LBJ, despite being this master politician, seemed unable to grasp the shifting tide of public opinion.
He was so deeply invested in the war,
Yeah.
so convinced of its necessity, that he just seemed incapable of admitting any error
Right.
in his strategy.
And this is where the podcast episode really gets interesting. Because amidst all this turmoil,
Yeah.
this growing opposition to the war, mounting pressure from within his own party,
Yeah.
this relatively unknown senator named Eugene McCarthy
Right.
steps onto the scene.
Yeah.
McCarthy was an unlikely challenger to LBJ.
Yes. Poetry-loving,
Right.
intellectual, a man who saw the campaign almost as a philosophical exercise.
Right. Not exactly your typical
Not your typical rabble-rouser.
firebrand politician, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But he saw the war as a moral issue, and he was willing to challenge the most powerful man in the world over it.
And his campaign, while initially seen as a long shot,
Yeah.
began to attract a following,
Yeah.
particularly among young people disillusioned with the war and the political establishment.
Uh-huh.
McCarthy's message of peace and change resonated with a generation
Right.
yearning for something different.
So you have LBJ, the seasoned politician,
Right.
facing this unexpected challenge from McCarthy, this intellectual outsider.
Yeah.
And then the Tet Offensive happens.
The Tet Offensive happened.
The Tet Offensive was a turning point.
It was.
The Viet Cong launched a surprise attack during the Vietnamese New Year.
Right.
And while it was ultimately repelled, it exposed the brutality of the war
Yeah.
and shattered American confidence. Imagine seeing those images on TV,
Right.
hearing those reports on the radio.
Uh-huh.
For many Americans, it was a wake-up call,
Yeah.
a realization that the war was far from over, and that the government might not be telling them the whole truth.
It was a huge psychological blow. The
Well?
narrative that the U.S. was winning the war,
Right.
that victory was just around the corner, that was shattered.
Right.
And LBJ, already facing mounting pressure,
Yeah.
now had to contend with a public that was increasingly skeptical
Yeah.
and demanding answers.
So the stage is set.
Right.
You have a deeply divided nation,
Wow.
a president grappling with his own flaws,
Right.
and an unwinnable war,
Yeah.
and a growing sense that something has to change.
Absolutely.
And it's in this context
Right.
that LBJ makes a decision that will shocks the world
Yeah.
and, like, irrevocably alter the course of American history.
Right.
But we'll have to delve into that
Yeah.
in the next part of our deep dive.
All right. So we left off with LBJ facing like mounting pressure
Yeah.
from the anti-war movement and this surprise challenge from Eugene McCarthy.
Yeah.
The Tet Offensive had shaken the nation's confidence, and the year 1968 was already shaping up to
Right.
be one for the history books.
And if I remember correctly, McCarthy's campaign was gaining momentum.
It was.
He was like pulling in these young volunteers, tapping into this like deep well of discontent among students and intellectuals.
Totally.
Was it the New Hampshire primary
Yeah.
where things really took off for him?
You're absolutely right. The New Hampshire primary was crucial. While McCarthy didn't win outright,
Right.
he came shockingly close
Mhm.
to beating LBJ.
Wow.
And that near victory sent shockwaves through the political establishment. It showed that LBJ was vulnerable, that the anti-war sentiment was a force to be reckoned with.
It's almost like that primary result was like a crack in the dam.
Yeah.
And suddenly everyone saw the possibility of change.
Right.
I mean, it must have been exhilarating for those who opposed the war.
Yeah.
Like a sign that their voices were finally being heard.
Exactly. And sensing that shift in the political landscape, another major player decided to enter the race just days later, Robert Kennedy.
Oh, wow. So now Robert Kennedy, or RFK, as he was often called,
Right.
was a figure who carried immense weight,
Yeah.
both politically and emotionally. He was JFK's brother carrying that legacy.
Right.
And he just had this charisma, this ability to connect with people on like a deeply personal level.
He was seen as a symbol of hope,
Yeah.
especially for the marginalized and disaffected.
Mhm.
His message of social justice and change resonated
Yeah.
with a broad coalition of voters.
Right.
And his entrance into the race completely upended the dynamics of the Democratic primary.
So you have LBJ, the incumbent president,
Yeah.
facing these two formidable challengers.
Yeah.
McCarthy, the intellectual outsider,
Uh-huh.
and Kennedy, the charismatic heir, a parent.
Right.
Talk about a political pressure cooker.
Yeah, the pressure was mounting on LBJ from all sides. The
Right.
war was dragging on. The economy was showing signs of strain,
Yeah.
and his own party was fracturing.
Right.
The episode we're diving into describes him as increasingly isolated,
Oh, wow.
struggling to sleep, relying on medication to cope with the stress.
You mentioned earlier the episode describing LBJ as tragic,
Right.
and I'm starting to understand why.
Yeah, there's this sense of inevitability.
Yeah.
Almost like watching a Greek tragedy unfold.
Right.
You have this flawed hero capable of great things,
Mhm.
but ultimately brought down by his own hubris, his inability to adapt
Wow.
to the changing times.
And it all culminates
Yeah.
in that shocking announcement on March 31st, 1968.
Right.
LBJ, in a televised address to the nation,
Uh-huh.
declares that he will not seek re-election.
Wow.
Can you imagine watching that speech live?
Oh, yeah.
It must have felt like the world had shifted on its axis.
Absolutely. It was a moment that sent shockwaves through the country and around the world.
Yeah.
The most powerful man in the world,
Right.
seemingly at the height of his power.
Voluntarily stepping down. It was unprecedented.
And in that moment, like, everything became uncertain.
Right.
The future of the Democratic Party,
Right.
with the course of the war,
Yeah.
the direction of the country, it was all up for grabs.
And into that void stepped a whole cast of characters.
Right.
Each vying for power.
Yeah.
Each offering their own vision of America's future.
Oh.
You had McCarthy and Kennedy battling for the soul of the Democratic Party.
Right.
Hubert Humphrey, LBJ's vice president, waiting in the wings.
Right.
And then there was Richard Nixon,
Oh, yeah.
the former vice president who'd lost a close election to JFK in 1960,
Right.
sensing an opportunity for a political comeback.
So 1968 was already a year of like dramatic twists and turns.
Oh, yeah.
But with LBJ's exit from the race,
Right.
things were about to get even wilder.
And what's incredible is that all this political drama is unfolding against a backdrop of even greater social and cultural upheaval.
Right.
The civil rights movement is gaining momentum.
Challenging the very foundations of American society.
Right.
The counterculture is emerging.
Yeah.
Questioning traditional values and norms. And the war in Vietnam continues to rage, casting a long shadow over everything.
It's almost like the country's going through this collective identity crisis.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out who it is and what it stands for. And as we head into the spring and summer of '68, that crisis is about to reach its boiling point.
You're absolutely right. But before we dive into that, there's one more aspect of LBJ's character that the episode highlights.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think sheds light on the complexities of leadership, especially during times of crisis.
Okay, I'm all ears. What is it?
Well, it's his, how should I put this? His tendency towards, let's say, unconventional behavior.
Okay.
The episode mentions his habit of conducting meetings in the bathroom.
What?
His rather colorful language,
Oh.
and his penchant for sharing perhaps a bit too much information about his personal life.
Oh, yes, the famous Johnson treatment. I've heard stories.
Yeah.
It sounds like he wasn't exactly known for his subtlety or decorum.
That's one way to put it. But what's interesting is that the episode suggests that these shall we say, idiosyncrasies were actually part of his political strategy.
Really?
It was a way of disarming his opponents, keeping them off balance, and ultimately getting what he wanted.
So it was all calculated.
It's certainly possible.
This image of the crude, outspoken Texan was a persona he cultivated to achieve his political goals.
And it raises interesting questions about the nature of leadership, about the masks we wear in public and the private struggles we all face. LBJ was a man of contradictions. Capable of both great kindness and ruthless ambition. And ultimately, I think it was that complexity, that duality, that made him such a fascinating and ultimately tragic figure.
It sounds like we're about to enter like a whole new level of intensity and drama as 1968 unfolds. What can you tell us about what's to come in the second half of this tumultuous year?
Well, buckle up.
Okay.
Because things are about to get even more intense. We have assassinations, riots, a political convention that descends into chaos. And an election that will reshape the political landscape for decades to come.
So we left off with LBJ's dramatic exit from the race and this feeling that like 1968 was about to explode. You know, the country was like deeply divided over the Vietnam War and the political landscape was in complete disarray. So where do we even go from here?
Well, with LBJ out of the picture, the Democratic primary became a three-way race between Eugene McCarthy, Robert Kennedy, and Hubert Humphrey. McCarthy, who had initially energized the anti-war movement, was struggling to maintain momentum. Kennedy, on the other hand, was surging in the polls, drawing huge crowds with his message of hope and change.
So it sounds like Kennedy was tapping into something deeper, something beyond just opposition to the war. Was there a sense that he represented like a new generation of leadership? Like a break from the old ways of doing things?
Absolutely. Kennedy was seen as a transformative figure, someone who could bridge the divides in American society and usher in a new era of social justice and progress. He spoke directly to the concerns of young people, minorities, and the working class. He represented a break from the old, tired politics of the past.
But what about Humphrey? He was LBJ's vice president, so he must have had a lot of support within the Democratic establishment. Was he seen as a viable contender?
Humphrey was definitely a formidable candidate. He had the backing of the party machinery, and he was a skilled politician in his own right. But he was also closely associated with LBJ's policies, including the Vietnam War, which made him a target for the anti-war movement.
So you have these three very different Democrats vying for the nomination, each representing a different vision for the future of the party and the country. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a war that's tearing the nation apart. What happens next?
Well, tragically, the story of 1968 takes another dark turn. On April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee.
Oh, wow.
His death sends shockwaves through the nation and ignites riots in cities across America.
It's hard to even imagine the grief and the outrage that people must have felt.
Yeah.
King was a symbol of hope and peace, and his assassination just felt like a devastating blow to the very soul of the country.
It was a profound loss, and it exposed the deep racial divisions that continued to plague American society. King's dream of a just and equitable America seemed further away than ever.
And just as the country was trying to grapple with King's death, another tragedy strikes. On June 5th, Robert Kennedy, just moments after winning the California primary, is assassinated in Los Angeles. I mean, Kennedy's death was just a devastating blow to those who saw him as the best hope for healing a divided nation. It felt like all the optimism and idealism of the 1960s had been extinguished in a single moment.
Yeah, it felt like a national nightmare.
So you have these two towering figures, both symbols of hope and progress, cut down in their prime. The country must have been in a state of shock and despair.
Absolutely. And as the Democratic National Convention approached in August, the party was deeply divided, unsure of how to move forward.
And what about Richard Nixon? Where does he fit into all of this?
Nixon, the ever-opportunistic politician, was watching all of this unfold with a keen eye. He sensed that the country was yearning for stability, for a return to law and order. And he positioned himself as the candidate who could provide that.
So while the Democrats were struggling to find their footing, Nixon was offering a message of strength and unity. Was it a message that resonated with voters?
It definitely resonated with a segment of the population, especially those who were tired of the protests and the turmoil. They saw Nixon as a steady hand, someone who could restore a sense of normalcy to a country that felt like it was spinning out of control.
You know, we've talked about how it was a year of unrest and protests. The Democratic Convention in Chicago must have been a complete disaster.
The Democratic Convention in Chicago was a complete meltdown. Anti-war protesters clashed with police in the streets, and the whole thing descended into chaos and violence.
Wow.
It was a stark reminder of how divided the country was, and it played right into Nixon's hands.
So amidst all this chaos and division, Nixon emerges as the candidate of stability and order. What happens in the election?
Nixon wins a close election, defeating Hubert Humphrey, who eventually secured the Democratic nomination.
Wow.
The country, exhausted by years of turmoil and uncertainty, was ready for a change. And Nixon promised to deliver that change.
So what's the legacy of 1968, this year of hope and tragedy, of progress and setbacks?
1968 was a pivotal year in American history, a year that exposed the deep fault lines in our society and forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. It was a year that shattered illusions and left lasting scars.
You know, it feels like we've covered so much ground in this deep dive, yet we've only scratched the surface. 1968 was a year of such complexity and contradiction.
It was.
A year that continues to fascinate and challenge us. What are some key takeaways you'd like our listeners to reflect on?
I think the most important takeaway is that history is never simple. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's full of surprises. And the events of 1968 remind us that progress is rarely linear. There are always setbacks, always challenges, always moments of doubt.
But even in the darkest of times, there's always hope. The human spirit is resilient.
It is.
And our capacity for change is limitless.
That's a great point. 1968 may have been a year of turmoil and upheaval, but it was also a year that sparked important conversations about race, about war, about the very nature of American democracy. And those conversations continue to this day.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with me.
Of course, it's been my pleasure.
And for our listeners out there, I encourage you to dive deeper into this fascinating and pivotal year in American history. There's so much more to discover,